that are the two presentations that I'm going to make. I think, like I said, I'm probably going to get to the first one. Can we see the next slide, please? Safeguards to prevent disinformation against women in electoral processes. And maybe this is not something that comes to mind immediately when we think of democracies. We know that more and more women are participating in democratic processes. However, the percentages, as you will see later in my presentation, are very much smaller compared to men. So when we start thinking about this particular program, it was because we were starting to look at the issue of women participation of decision-making processes and how low that participation was also in comparison to men, how they were potentially the main beneficiaries of policies everywhere, but at the end of the day, at the moment of really intervening on policy making, they were not taken part of because of cultural and other reasons. Can we move to the next slide? So, but the thing is that with the crisis, with the global crisis, and I think that is very important for all of us to recognize that we have a global crisis in democracy. Democracy has been under threat even before the COVID pandemic. During the pandemic, we call disinformation and fake news another pandemic affecting democracy, and we've seen how repression of peaceful protests, extra constitutional measures that have been taken in multiple countries around the world against free elections and equal protection of the law have really shown that we are at this pivoting point where we can do great when it comes to democracy, or we can really regress. And like I said, the pandemic has aggravated these issues. Even some strong democratic leaders are taking advantage of the pandemic and the crisis to consolidate power through emergency laws that at the end of the day impact human rights. I'm not going to mention the name of the country, but there is a country in Latin America that decided that if someone publishes something related to disinformation, or that it might be considered disinformation, then they can go to jail for 6 years. And that, if you look at that, is not only in the aspect of disinformation, that could be potentially be a human rights defender saying something that then the government might consider it not true, and then they can send that defender to jail. So we have long known that the lies spread faster than truth, and the real problem arises when these lies are believed. And funny enough, we're more prone to believe lies than to believe truth. So while some beliefs are harmless, others are used as weapons. And one of those main weapons today against democratic processes is disinformation. So next slide, please. So what is disinformation? And we were just talking with Nada about this, and I really want to hear from the audience, whether it's virtual or here, what do you know about disinformation? Because in multitudes and you know the research that we've been doing for almost a year now, we've discovered that people know what disinformation is, but not really. They don't consider it online violence. They when they think of online violence, they think about hate speech, they think about fake news, big fakes, doxing, data protection violations, but they really, they might have it in the background, but it's not really a full connection. And the definition is very clear and simple. It is false or misleading information that is disseminated and created to mislead and cause harm to a person, to a group, or to organization. That is the main objective: to harm someone, making everyone believe that that person is doing something or is being something that is not. False speech, non-deliberate informational errors of the media, unfortunately, that's what is so important, and we'll see that one of the main ways to combat disinformation is actually due diligence. And then fake news and misleading content also talks to about hate speech. When we do hate speech, we do two things. You know, we're creating a discourse about violence against someone, but in some cases, hate speech is also used in the form of disinformation. Next slide, please. So when we talk about disinformation in the electoral process, we have to consider multiple aspects. And one view, actually, that was carried out by the Association for Civic Rights, is the complexity in the analysis of disinformation in electoral context, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm originally from Chile. That's my Latin America is my region, and unfortunately, it's one of the regions that is most affected by disinformation and fake news, because a lot of people believe on social media as a main source of information and news. And on the other hand, in Latin America, also we go through layers of lack of regulation in the access and handling of data protection, which also opens kind of a door for disinformation campaigns to be widespread. So the layer of disinformation, more complex, I would say, it is the data protection, since there is malicious handling, misrepresentation, and use of sensitive or reserved data that makes its owners vulnerable. And then we go to the entire question of who is the owner of my data, which is, it's yet another very much complicated discussion. So this lack of data regulations allows the creators of this information to really look into available data, in particular people, using that data to create bubbles of disinformation for each person that uses the internet. Next slide. So to approach this phenomenon and its threats against democracy, we must take into account that the aims and impacts of targeted campaign against women participating in the electoral process have very specific characteristics than when targeted towards men. We're not saying that men are not the target of this information. It's just when it comes to women participating in electoral processes, the content is very specific. So there is an organization called Chequea Bolivia that actually carried out a survey with women in politics and found out that women are affected with disinformation campaigns that are based on vanity or their sexual lives, which is not the same for the men's survey. And the Interparliamentary Union in Switzerland published a report, and everyone refers back to the report. It's a very good report, but it's a tiny little small report, because one of the main issues also in disinformation and fake news in the electoral processes is that we don't have a lot of data to analyze. But that being said, the Interparliamentary Union published a report called Sexism, Harassment, and Violence Against Women Parliamentarians, in which almost 42% of the women surveyed said that they had been victims of extremely humiliated and loaded sexual images in the form of disinformation and social media. It's not like it was their bodies, their faces. These were campaigns, and the way to affect them was actually put in these pictures that were fake pictures in social media. So this shows that the impact of disinformation and fake news is actually a form of gender and digital violence, and that is transversal to public and private life, because what it hopes for is to delegitimize women and their private life, so that impacts their public life, and hopefully that will make them think whether or not they want to go into politics. Next slide. So and we can go back just to the previous US election when we really saw and witnessed a bunch of coordinated disinformation campaign who were actually running for election and in very particular positions. For example, like it happened with Vice President Harris. We know that there was a lot of disinformation campaign targeting her, but in reality, despite of the fact that it was targeting her, it was trying also to target the entire democratic system by impacting the elections. Or in Chile, where Elisa Loncon, today the president of the Conventional Constitution, is also a target of disinformation and fake news. That again, not only hopes to delegitimize her work, but also desestabilize a very important process in Chile related to drafting a new constitution. Next slide. So why we feel that low female political participation is a threat to the democracy in itself, and why do we look at the issue of disinformation? Nowadays, only 25% of parliament seats worldwide are used by women. And in 2020, the number of countries with no women in government actually increased, unfortunately. But reversing a promising trend that we had seen in previous years. In Latin America and the Caribbean, the women participation in electoral process is actually below 25%. And in Chile, where we started our research, at the local level, only 10% of women are elected to become a mayor or a city council. It's very low. Next slide, please. So why is it so important, women's participation in democracy? Because sliding backwards is basically not an option, as we've seen in the last year, not only because we hope for equity representation, because that's the ideal of democracy, and that's what we should strive for, but also because we know that more women represent more stability, equality, social welfare. Just in the area of the government, we know that the more women in power, the less corruption rates we have. And also particularly because women are more focused on health, education, and development, and their participation actually boosts the confidence of citizens. So next slide. So what we really need to do is to remove barriers designed to keep women from public leadership. That's what's happening. And unfortunately, disinformation campaigns, in most cases, conceived and disseminated by different economic and interest groups, are aiming at keeping them out of the public life. So disinformation is one of those main barriers, especially in an age when people increasingly get their information through social media. And there are a bunch of studies that show now that social media users are most likely to believe actually disinformation than non-users. So according to this Public Studies Center in Chile, from a survey carried out in 2019, social media is the second platform in which citizens trust the most, with 28%. I'm pretty embarrassed at this number, I would say, as Chilean. To this, is added that the latest report from Digital News Report showed that social media is the main means by which people are informed in the world, with 78%. So it is great to have social media, particularly for women participating in electoral processes, because you have a tool to connect with potential voters, know when it's interfering, but at the same time, as we see, this is a double-edged sword. And in addition, there is a study by the Catholic University in Chile indicating that 60% of those surveyed in this study have heard fake news being social media the most used platform to consume information, with a 60% preference. And that's in Chile, is a developing country, imagine what's the situation in other countries. So next slide. So what can we do? Is there an antidote to this information? Well, I think that there are governance, private sector, and research-based solutions. I mean, one of the main things, and we've seen this, how it's happening in multiple countries, is that they're taking the lead in the fight against disinformation with initiatives that include multi-component strategy, aiming to support democracy and social cohesion in the country by building a citizen reliance against online disinformation. And one of the main and most important things is education, believe it or not. The fact that, again, like I said in the beginning, we don't make the connection between disinformation and online gender violence per se, or when we talk about this information, someone says, yeah, because I've seen so and so that said that this person, or hate speech. It's the main issue, because without knowing what exactly this information is, then there is no way to recognize those campaigns and combat disinformation. So that's where we have this multiple approach to where we are starting to think in terms of how we can educate so they think twice before disseminating this information campaign, but also they better understand how to recognize it. And so some of these governments, and I think I can mention Canada, UK, and some of this approach, as well as, for example, the OECD is also having a very particular and very good approach, are developing citizen-focused activities, including, like I said, civic literacy and tools, research and civic society and academia capacity building through grants and contributions. This is something that where a lot of civil society organizations can get involved. And this is leading an approach to promote a healthy information ecosystem by helping citizens and governments to better understand disinformation and its impact on democracy. The goal of this type of approach is actually identify potential action and develop future policymaking by using evidence. Next one, please. So in addition to social media companies must acknowledge, and that's one of the main issues, we can't put all the blame in government's lack of regulation in terms of combating disinformation, because again, we're going to get to the point where this country, Latin America, says, okay, if you publish a piece of disinformation, you're going to jail. We really need to look into social media companies, social media platforms. Nowadays, the approach of social media platforms is actually being reactive. They see something, surveillance tools, or saying, well, I think that this is disinformation, this might be fake news, remove it. But that has already been published, and the after truth sets it, and it's very difficult, almost impossible to remove the after truth. So they really need to understand the harm they are facilitating. I mean, it's very interesting that we have this BBL today and yesterday. This ex-employee of Facebook was talking about, how Facebook actually privilege earnings versus, the well-being of their users. So, and they also have to take an approach at really encouraging users to think twice before posting or sharing content, and then applying due diligence, which is one of the main solutions that the UK and also OECD are requesting countries to apply. For example, I think that if I'm not mistaken, during the 2020 US presidential campaign, that's exactly what Twitter did. Twitter asked before posted, are you sure that this is real? Can you make sure that you know what's the source of this piece of information? And that's sometimes all that it takes, asking people to really take a second look about what they're doing, because once that's done, believe me, no reactive policy from any social media can delete what just has been said and the damage that is doing, for example, a woman that is running for electoral processes. Next. So, however, our best chance actually is research, especially when it's targeted against women participating in electoral processes, because we need to document and analyze gendered disinformation so we can respond more effectively to policymaking. And that's where, at this point, we are in a real issue. This is a huge challenge, again, because all that you potentially have seen and read about this information targeting women in electoral processes is based in observation. It's really not based on a particular data sets that are talking, or a data set that is talking about the impact. I know that there are some organizations out there that are looking at this in live time, basically at the electoral process and saying, this woman, this so-and-so has been affected, this is the way it has been affected. But when it comes to looking at the type of content, the electoral position, whether it is local, regional, national, the background of the women running for electoral for public office, all that has a tremendous impact, not only during the election, but also after the election and in the democratic processes. So to put this information in the national agenda and encourage systems change that allows women to participate more actively in decision-making process is key to building equal and stable democracies, believe it or not. I mean, it's very difficult to have a sound democracy, as we've seen, and now we know that low women participation in electoral processes and disinformation are actually almost little clues out there to look at the country backsliding democracy. So next one. Is this number 15? Okay. I think oh, can you go back one please? Yeah, I just wanted to mention this because I think this is very important. One of the main things that we need to understand about this information against women that participate in electoral processes is that they really seek to nullify and prevent and restrict their participation in democracy. There is no data as how many women in vulnerable groups actually participate in electoral process in Latin America. We really don't know that. And also noting that we don't know nothing about how many women withdraw from public office or electoral processes as candidates once they have been victims of disinformation. So we have multiple data sets that we need in our research. We don't have that data. And finally, when it comes to the issue of disinformation affecting women in electoral processes, most of the data is carried out in studies in the United States, Canada, and Europe. We don't know too much about the other regions. Now, so one of the things that we can go to the next slide. One of the things that Multitudes decided to do, and this is based on a previous project funded by Open Society Formation, the women's rights, the former women's rights program, and where we were looking at how to reduce the gap between women and decision-making processes. During that process, we carried out a lot of conversations with many women from different areas, from the volunteer world, from the activism, from the political spheres, from the LGBTQ communities, and they were all coming with the same response. One of the main threats for us to participate in politics is actually disinformation. And because in Multitudes, we really believe in research-based advocacy, and in the context of a very intense electoral calendar for this year and for the next couple of years in Latin America, we decided to actually launch a women's observatory against disinformation and fake news. And the aim is actually to monitor the dissemination of disinformation as a form of digital and gender-based violence created to delegitimize women who want to participate in electoral processes. Next. So their general objective, I think it's next. I'm sorry. I think it's the next slide. There you go. Okay, so it's identify the campaigns, active disinformation and fake news against women who are actively participating in electoral processes, to place basically in the public agenda the issue of how this affects women, prevent the normalization of the digital gender violence against women. I want to explain briefly later what we call normalization and how we realize that this is also part of the issue, and then promote changes in public policies to safeguard the participation of women politics. And that public policies can be in the form of, like I said, education, regulation, etc. So next, and between some of the activities, we actually carry out a survey with all women parliamentarians in Chile. And we're looking at carry out the same survey in Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, which are basically the main scenarios between 2021 and 22 in terms of electoral processes in Latin America. And we also want to include mayors and activists, and we will be monitoring social media for some candidates. So the data will be then analyzed, particularly, like I said before, the type of content used in disinformation campaigns against women, and also being able to collect data to put it openly for everyone to analyze in the different countries. So then
I just wanted to do a quick time check, maybe in the next 5 minutes if we
Yeah,
wrap up,
I'm
so we have
almost-
lots of discussion. Yeah.
Yes, I'm almost done. So, like I said, we're going to conduct a survey. And next one. And again, we were going to disaggregate the information based on, for example, gender identity, ethnicity, social class, age, place of residency, advocacy background, etc., to see also the different forms of discrimination within this information. And then with that data, we hope to carry out advocacy activities to position this information as a main issue related to gender violence in public discussion, and hopefully develop recommendations for the media and public authorities to prevent this type of campaigns. So can we go to the next one? And we have some preliminary results from the survey particularly carried out in Chile. Like I said, we survey all women parliamentarians in Chile. 90% of congresswomen and 100% of the senators surveyed feel that as elected women, they are more exposed to being victims of disinformation than their male colleagues. Next one. And 95% of the congresswomen and 100% again of the senators have been victims of disinformation as a form of gender violence, and they recognize actually as a form of gender violence. They have, when we ask them whether or not they will still run for public office if they were aware that they could be victims of disinformation and fake news, 90% of the congresswomen said, I will still run, and 100% of the senators said that they will still run. So I know we wanted to leave some time for discussion, but one of the main things that I wanted to tell you about the last questions that we made is that actually that's a concept that we have recognized as being normalizing process of disinformation in public life. Women feel that because they are part of public life, they should tolerate this type of gender violence against them because that's politics, because politics is tough, because it's without crying, it's because I have a tough skin now and no one can hurt me. So, and they do not consider it as something that happens particularly to women, but actually in the form that it happens, it's actually specifically targeted women. So I think that, I have a lot more slides. I knew that I was going to run much longer, but I think it's important that we'll leave a little bit of time for discussions and questions from the audience. Thank you so much.
Awesome, cool. Thank you so much, Paulina. This is fascinating. Definitely my first time hearing a presentation like this. Like you said, really identifying this powerful link between how women in public life are being targeted online compared to their male colleagues. And yeah, would love to have some questions, whether you're on Zoom or here in the room. I'll just give you maybe one or two of my first questions just to kick us off while people may queue up their own questions. I think one thing you mentioned is like how important it is to have a multi-pronged approach to solve this problem, right? You have to think about private sector engagement, public sector engagement, civic education, and even what are some of the simple nudges that can reduce the harm, right? Like asking people, are you sure you want to share this? I know as a user of WhatsApp, all day, every day, the feature that they added where you can see if something has been forwarded many times makes me think twice about like, okay, maybe this is not such a credible source. So like even, yeah, I wonder, what do you think are some other kind of simple nudges that frankly, social media companies might be willing to implement, which can be good for them, but also really good for the users and kind of reducing the likelihood of harm?
It's education. I mean, as you said, I mean, the approach that they took with WhatsApp is, again, reactive, not proactive. It's really not strategic. They realized that a lot of dissemination and fake news campaigns were actually being disseminated through this platform. But beyond that, if you ask my mom, for example, what does it mean to have 2 clicks? Yeah. She said, oh, someone read it, maybe, or there is no real knowledge about the type of approaches and tools that social media platforms are taking to kind of combat disinformation and fake news. They're just put out there. So again, I think that the main issue has to be education. That's one thing. The other part is probably analyzing the type of content that is being disseminated and trying to figure out how, for example, this lexicon dictionary that they use, the same dictionary that they have to actually promote, for example, advertising on their social media platforms, can be potentially used to recognize potential disinformation and fake news campaigns without getting into censorship. Because we know that there are multiple dictionaries built out there that might be able to recognize through the use of algorithms or artificial intelligence, whether or not a particular word is being used in a sentence as, again, disinformation or hate speech or whatever. So I think it will be important to take that approach from their perspective and apply it in a very strategic and preventive way than having the surveillance tools, looking at social media posts and saying, oh, and we know that they can do that.
We have a question in the chat from Liliana. Liliana, would you like to ask it live? Okay, I will just read it. Her question is, you said that we should move from reactive practices, but Liliana is interested in learning more about whether these outlets that spread disinformation are held accountable for their actions. Are they suffering consequences that may deter them from this due to system failure or possibly corrupt practices? Also, is lack of sanctions not going to undermine any activities such as education aimed at end users?
So thank you for your question. I think the first part is that unfortunately, well, fortunately, maybe I shouldn't say unfortunately, but when we talk about disinformation and fake news and the way that's spread, particularly when it comes to women, it is very difficult to not talk about censorship. So it is a real issue between, for example, advocates like me and journalists. It is a positive discussion always, but they feel that if they're publishing something, and in many cases, the news might be the content of a disinformation campaign. So from my advocacy perspective, I want that journalism not to publish it. Meanwhile, that journalists might think that this is the real news because they're saying something about this person. We know that is not true. And so we need to inform users about that. So when we talk about disinformation campaigns, we really need to be careful on where is the gray area, not to start using censorship techniques against media. And that's why there is no cookie cutter solution for this. I mean, governments are constantly trying to surveillance these particular issues with the support of the private sector, in some cases, media platforms. But at the end of the day, we know that sanctioning is not the answer, because we might run into, again, affecting freedom of speech, freedom of media. Some people talk about censorship. I mean, if a surveillance tool, a bot, or a social media platform is keeping tracks on where I'm posting stuff or what am I saying, and then they remove a post, that might also be considered censorship. So, and the second part of the question was about education.
Yes, basically, are they suffering any consequences that may deter them from similar behavior? And then doesn't that undermine any activities such as education?
Well, they're not. It will definitely depend on the country, what type of sanctions are taken. And that's why our approach is actually educating more than sanctioning. We feel that there are certain infractions that could be applied to particular groups, and we don't want to get into that discussion. I think it's much more important to make sure that they understand that the regulatory framework in a country includes certain sanctions. For example, in the case of defamation and other potential crimes. I don't know if that crime is the right question. So there are venues for you to, for example, sue someone that has said something against you, but there are no particular sanctions of that type to social media platforms or media outlets. And that also has to do with the fact that media, and I agree with this, feels that fake news are almost an oxymoron, because what they do is to report news, and news are basically a matter of fact. So again, not a lot of sanctions, and of course, if there are sanctions, they might be more willing, that they might go, social media and media outlets might go into the route of continue being reactive than proactive. And yes, it might affect the importance that they might affect some of the activities that they have related to education. But then again, that's where we need to have a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah, I'll just add really quickly. We actually a couple of years ago did a case study about civic education in Finland, and like to combat misinformation, and how if they have for every year of schooling, like this curriculum is incorporated. So yeah, that's available on the Defending Democracy website from Open Gov Hub as well.
Right.
But I see we have a couple more questions. Why don't we'll take Max in the room and then go to Yokai on Zoom. So Max, go ahead.
Yeah, so I kind of have two questions. The first is related to targeting. So I was wondering, because you talked a lot about disinformation targeting specific candidates and people already involved in politics, but are there also, in your experience, have you seen disinformation targeting maybe like potential voters or strategies to decrease voter turnout among women as well and decrease participation of that?
So our research is basically focusing on women that want to participate in electoral processes or that have been elected to processes. But what you say is not far-fetched from how the disinformation campaigns are actually created. Because it's not, like I said before, it's not just about delegitimizing one woman. If that woman, for example, is part of a diverse community or LGBT community or original people's community or a vulnerable and minority group in society, they're just not affected, that women. that are affecting the perception that voters have on the community that the women belongs to. So that's why we need to be very, very careful, because at the end of the day, we're just not affecting one woman's participation in public life. We are affecting the community that is behind. We're affecting the perception. We know nowadays that many disinformation campaigns against women participating in electoral processes are basically initiated, designed, and constructed because these groups behind these campaigns are against women participating in public life, period. One of the best examples of that happened during the beginning of the pandemic, when you remember there was around March 8th, International Day of Women, and all the women participated in a Pacific march around the world. And then we started seeing how the news were starting to talk, social media platforms, digital news outlets, news, even in some cases, government officials and politicians talking about that the Women's March movement had actually helped the spread of coronavirus. So it's sort of funny, right? But it is particularly used to say, guess what? When women go out and protest and try to defend their rights, they are actually not putting everyone at risk. Don't go out. So do you see what I mean? It's definitely beyond more than just one woman affected by disinformation campaigns.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yokai, I wanted to see if you still had a question and wanted to ask it for us.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to thank you for bringing this topic and discussion front and center. I think it's long overdue. And I think I noticed particularly in the accountability, the TPA sector, that there's a lot of focus on supporting, funding, fueling movements that support like gender budgeting and gendered approaches to various sector development challenges. And then on the governance end, it's very much empowering women and empowering voices in participation in public processes. But it's never really about how do we defend and protect women's voices and participation from attacks, state-sponsored attacks, whether it's through online or through direct intimidation. It almost seems like when you start talking about threats and intimidation and attacks and human rights, and it just get bundled up in the human rights category or censorship media type discussion. And I always kind of feel like women's experiences sort of get ignored or not given the proper attention and focus that it needs. So this is actually the first time, and I know I've been working in this sector for quite some time, that I've actually come across such an engaging and very focused and targeted one. And I was just wondering why your assessment of that. Maybe I'm not in tune with the latest in the sector around this topic, but I just want to hear your assessment as to why you probably think it is the way it is. The discussions and around this, and also just to kind of get your sense about the disparities between how much this is an issue in the developing world versus the third world. I know many women, I'm from Zimbabwe, many African women who are in this sector and have had to deal with this issue for quite some time, and it's sort of been normalized and not given the proper attention as I suggested. So I'm just wondering if there is a discrepancy between those two contexts and if there's a reason as to why there's a discrepancy.
Thank you so much. Yes. So I think that the first, the answer to your first question, I think, is politics. Basically, we know that the issue of disinformation and fake news and how it affects women is not something that has been deeply considered, because when you look at just at the national level in a particular country, we don't see safeguards for women participation of the electoral process, period. It's not just a matter of disinformation or the tool being used to carry out campaigns that we've seen more and more women are using social media as a main form of reaching out their constituents. But it really has to do with the framework, the regulatory framework in the countries. And we see how, for example, in so many countries, there is no parity in election. There is no quota legislation in terms of equal number of women participating or being candidates to a particular position. We don't see, for example, also parity in the political parties. We don't see that type of situation happening where within the political party there is regulation to allow for equal participation of women and men. And so this disinformation part is just one more component, and on everything is definitely a political issue, where we see that men continue being at the front of every single, unfortunately, democratic process. And if we don't also work in tandem, like I said, with education programs, if we don't want to kind of reshape the regulatory framework in the countries, allowing for women to participate in an equal way of electoral processes, it's very difficult that we can change the rest of the scenario. So that's why our approach is really based on the data that we will be collecting and analyzing, make recommendations for governments, media, civil societies in terms of how to combat disinformation, but also working with multi-stakeholders, partnerships such as, for example, we are in early discussions with OGP to see how this data might feed into the co-creation process for the next couple of years, cohorts of countries. If we don't all do that collectively, it's very difficult that we can achieve anything. And on the second part of your question, I think that it is an issue everywhere, not only in Latin America, in Africa, or in Asia. It's just we don't have data to back up how big of an issue this is. So when we look at what's happening, for example, with disinformation and fake news in the US, in some countries in Europe and Canada, we see that there is some research being carried out in the form of observation, because maybe they are the most predominant in terms of publishing disinformation campaigns and what's happening and what's not. So I don't see it as an issue that is affecting more region than others. I think that it's like global situation, but I do know that one of the main issues is not having data quality in those regions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Let's take a final quick question online, and then I'll close us with a few takeaways. It looks like Liliana, your hand is raised. If you want to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yeah, my hand is raised, but I actually just saw a question from somebody else that may have not asked a question at all. So I will just yield the floor to them if they would like to.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, any final questions from others who haven't spoken?
I have a question actually, but I wanted to read out Yokai's comment because you can't see them. She's saying it's frustrating that there isn't data on gender disinformation, because what is the point of empowering women to participate in the public processes if those voices are going to be undermined and silenced?
Yeah, that's very important.
Yeah. I have a very quick question. What about culture? If we're talking about systems change and political processes, a lot of these issues unfortunately have underlying cultural limitations for women and what is appropriate for women to do in the public space. No matter what country you're looking at, women, even if they make up obviously half of society, are not equally represented in the government, and oftentimes are vulnerable to disinformation that is based in sexual violence or any of those things. because of the way that culture is structured. And that applies to every single country in the world. So if we're looking at Finland, Finland's much more progressive. If we're looking even at the United States, we never had a woman president. We don't have the same representation. So how do you address like systems change without culture change, I guess? And what would be your recommendation in like the civic participation to engage communities to push the progressive views forward?
It's a big question, and it's going to be our final question.
Yes,
so
definitely. But I'm
gonna
answer from my perspective. My personal opinion is almost like that situation to me is like, what's first, the chicken or the egg?
Yeah.
Because in so many cases, we'll say, well, we need to change culture for people to change. Da, da, da. My perspective that in some cases you need strong changes in terms of regulatory frameworks and policy in order to start cultivating that cultural change. So unless you look at doing hardcore advocacy towards, for example, policy changes around the issue of women participating, for example, running for Congress or running for mayors or city council, is very difficult that you will start seeing a small change in culture. So that's why I always put it like the chicken or the egg type of answer.
Absolutely, yeah. This is, I feel like, we could talk for many more hours, but this is an amazing discussion. Really appreciate everyone who's joined us. Let me ask quickly, Paulina, if people want to follow up with you, if they have further ideas,
sure.
What's the best way to get in contact?
The best way to get in contact is through our website, fundacionmultitudes.org. You can also directly email me, paulina.ibarra@fundacionmultitudes.org, or also follow us on Instagram and on Twitter or Facebook. We're there too.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you have any trouble remembering any of that, feel free to reach out to us as the Hub team. Again, we're super excited to continue partnering with Fundación Multitudes as our affiliate hub in Chile, and one of the very first in Latin America.
And by the way, Nada, sorry, shortly, is we're really looking for partners that like to work on this issue, particularly and primarily in Latin America, but also in other regions like Africa and Asia.
Perfect, cool. So I'll just close us with 3 really quick takeaways. We try to do this at the end of our Hub events just to share some of the great ideas that have come up, and then we'll thank Paulina for joining us. Definitely one big takeaway I've gotten is you can't empower women to be more politically involved if you're not also thinking about the attacks that they can face online and offline, and what are we doing to protect them from those attacks. Number 2, this gender online violence has a lot to do with trying to delegitimize women in the private sphere so that they're not active in the public sphere. So we really need to take many strategies to combat that. And then finally, the good news is many women, political leaders think they have tough skin, and they think, oh, I just have to tolerate this in public life. So they're maybe very strong, but we also don't want to normalize this as the culture and the expectation that women are more likely to get attacked when they are in public life. So I think we have a lot of work ahead of us, but really, really thankful for this discussion. Please join me in giving a round of applause for your questions. We can all stay in touch. Yeah, thank you everyone so much, and enjoy the rest of your day, wherever you may be.